My name is Janine Matsuda, and thanks for stopping by for today's video, which is on literacy, specifically on how to help your students with vocabulary. We know that it's not necessary for comprehension for every single vocabulary word to be understood. But we also know that when students take the time to look up words and stop and figure out what a word means, it increases their comprehension greatly. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but authors, and I don't know if they do it intentionally or it's just by happenstance, but authors will regularly repeat words. They'll repeat vocabulary words through a text. So if a student early on takes the time to figure out what a word means, then when they encounter it again, there's a greater chance of knowing the meaning of it, and even more exciting when they find that same word in another text, which is just thrilling when that happens. So I've done a video on how I do vocabulary, and that's not what this is going to be, although I do want to just remind you, at the beginning of the year, I buy these little composition books for 50 cents, and they are our vocabulary books. And the students every week need to choose 10 words from their reading, either from read aloud, from their dear book, from our guided reading books, from anywhere. They can hear a word on the radio, but they have to come up with 10 words every single week. And I encourage them to get ahead. We're on week 27 right now, and I have students who are on week 30 plus. Just keep going ahead. And then they have to define them, write the word down, and do a short definition. It doesn't need to be in complete sentences or anything. How do they get those definitions? They can look them up on their Chromebooks in a dictionary, which I've taught them how to use in our classroom, or they can even just ask me what a definition is. And sometimes I even have to look up the definitions because I'm not sure. I consider it a great joy when that happens, when authors are using books in children's literature that even I don't know the meanings for, so we have to look them up. But I do require them to make all of their words in their definition and their words that they've written down, they have to spell them properly. Everything in that definition has to be spelled properly to get the point. It's just 10 out of 10, and then I enter that into my grade book each week, and they love vocabulary. You know, when we come to guided reading, I always spend a few moments. We have to cut it short, or the whole entire 30-minute guided reading period would just be vocabulary. But we go around and we each share some vocabulary that we have found. And then the students will often write that vocabulary in their own book if they haven't already. We'll write it on our word wall. And just this last week, Cole K, in the middle of this activity, he said, I could just do this all day. And the others in his group agreed. And, you know, his group is all boys. And we just love vocabulary. If your students, and they've tried this with me, if your students are coming to you and saying, well, I'm just not finding vocabulary words, well, that usually is one of two things. They haven't trained themselves or been taught yet how to stop and look for vocabulary. We are often in such a habit of just reading past. You and I, adults, do this all the time, just reading past a vocabulary word. So they have to actually train themselves to be little detectives looking for those vocabulary words. Or the student is reading a book that is below their grade level. It's a too easy book. And we know that there is great value in reading easy books. That's a fabulous way of practicing fluency, but it is not always the best way to find vocabulary. So that's why that instructional reading level is so critical for finding vocabulary words. So I've talked to you before about annotating and how much I love annotating. Jane annotated in a book this week. I stopped her. I said, Jane, are you annotating? She was, during guided reading, she stopped and got a pencil and started marking in the margin. I wish I had remembered to bring her book home so I could share it with you. I'll do it on another video. But one way that I enjoy teaching students how to annotate, and I don't know if that's something you feel comfortable with letting your students write in your books, but I find it a great way to help them with their metacognition is to stop and actually make a note, or they can use Post-its. So I did not make this up. I found this method in a workshop several years ago. But we have these little mini manila folders, which I love. And then you have, and I have a nice typed one at school, but I forgot to bring it home. You make some kind of a legend, and the students can do it on their own. They can create their own. I use eyes for when they made a visualization. They made a mental picture, that TV in your brain when you're reading. A question. Wow, this was an important part. Or a P for a prediction, or you can actually have them write out prediction, or an exclamation mark for this is a surprising fact, and then LOL for something that's funny. And then they take these little Post-its and they put those marks on their Post-its, and then as they're reading, they keep this little booklet with them, and as they're reading, they're putting Post-its in the book as they're going. And I'm finding that I evidently use a lot of Post-its in my classroom every year. A good chunk of money goes towards Post-its. I just have them all over in a variety of sizes. So that's one way to introduce annotating to your students. And, we love when transfer occurs. And this week, Lucas, in his guided reading book, I'd already taught them this, but we weren't doing it for this particular week, last week. And Lucas came to guided reading, and his book looked like this. And I said, Lucas, what are you doing there? There were no marks on the little Post-its, but his book was covered with these. And he said, well, I'm marking all the vocabulary. I didn't tell him to do that. He just thought that up. And I said, Lucas, from henceforth, that will be called in this classroom the Lucas method. And of course, he was very pleased. And so I've taught all of my guided reading groups now. I have 4 different guided reading groups. That this is what we call the Lucas method. And as we are reading, so they asked for these back then. They asked for these little booklets back. And they said, we want to have them so that we can mark our vocabulary words. And it makes it so much easier. Then when we meet, they can open it up and there's their vocabulary word and we can talk about it. Making vocabulary come to life. I can't talk about the Lucas method without, and thank you, Lucas, for thinking of that. You've changed my classroom, Lucas. But I can't talk about that without telling you about Fiona and Jordan, who have been doing a different method all year with a Post-it. They have been using a little Post-it in their book. They just keep a Post-it in their book and they jot down their vocabulary words because they don't always want to stop right then when they're in the flow of reading to look up a word. So what they're doing is they're jotting down the words and then looking them up at a later time and then transferring that into their composition books. And they're not the only ones that have been doing that. Fiona, one week, she even had a Post-it wrapped around her pencil, and then whenever she'd come to a word, she would unfurl it and write it down and then put it back up. So then I always have my Post-it with me. It's such a joy for me to see how students are making these strategies real for them, what works for them. Because really, is this something that they could continue throughout their life? Absolutely. This is not some worksheet that they're never going to use. This is a Post-it that's helping them to make meaning for themselves as they read. And, we all use Post-its. So I'm hoping that this is something that will become a lifelong habit for them. And I wanted to share with you, the kinds of words they write down. They write down really beautiful vocabulary words. But sometimes they write down words that I don't think are particular vocabulary words. This week someone asked me what a while meant, and I thought, as soon as I tell you what it means, maybe you're having trouble pronouncing it. As soon as I tell you the pronunciation, you're going to know. And he said, I don't know what a while means. I would have thought that had been learned from a long time ago. But he probably read over that word 100 times and never stopped to look at it. Tardy was another word. These simple little words that sometimes they don't know. We are in a sad period of our world history right now where we have an invasion going on, and I don't know about you, but I took out the maps during daily geography to show my students what was happening, where it's happening, so that they could have an idea. And it led to some talks about fear. And Kane, that week that I discussed it with them, he decided to do his entire vocabulary, all 10 words, on phobias. And 2 weeks in a row of phobias. Dromophobia. I bet you don't know what that is. I didn't know. It's a fear of running. It was so interesting to me. You know, they're making this vocabulary personal for themselves. And it's not me saying, boys and girls, welcome to guided reading today. These are your vocabulary words. They are finding words that they need to know. And oftentimes, you know, when we're in group, someone will say a word, and then his neighbor or her neighbor will say, oh, I already know that word. So, you know, he or she doesn't need to write that one down. We're just looking for words that we personally need. And I keep one of these too. I keep one at school and one at home. Last year, it was Kevin who found, I don't know how he found it, but he found the longest word in our English language. It starts with pneumo something. It's a lung infection of some kind. And it was Guillermo who took it upon himself to learn how to say that word. And Stanley's going to put that for you so you can hear the word yourself. I don't ever plan on using that word, but for those boys, it was fun that week to learn and say the longest word in our language.
Newman ultra microscopic silico-volcanoconiosis.
Reading is critical. And in this time, well, any time of history, when you look at leaders, do you ever look at a leader and say, have they read anything? Has that leader ever read a book? You know, a worthwhile book, an important book? Because I keep thinking, no, clearly these people are not readers. I came across a man from South Africa, and I wish I could say his first name. I don't know how to say it, but his last name is Marwala, and wonderful Stanley will somehow link that for you if you would like to look him up. He is an engineer, and he is currently the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of Johannesburg. Isn't that fun to think of the word principal? Like we have presidents in our country for universities, but aren't they just the principal? But listen to what this gentleman says about reading. Those who don't read should not lead. I'll see you next time.